Okay, let's talk about some principles of classical conditioning, which are also going to be principles that are consistent a lot of times with operant conditioning. But let's dive into the classical conditioning sort of phenomenon first. So one thing that we get with conditioning is a sort of increase of responses of conditioned responding until we reach some kind of asymptote. So in this case, it's going to be this sort of high level of responding, but it will flatten out. So this is about the highest level that it will stick to and maintain, the asymptotic level of conditioned responding. And what does it actually sort of look like? This is just a very basic example of using some type of Pavlovian conditioning for tone or generating a type of response to a particular tone that's presented. So here is the dog. This is just a few trials or sessions into Pavlovian conditioning. The dog's just looking around, hanging out, and then a tone will turn on in just a second. Tone turns on. You get some general reaction or notice of the tone, but otherwise he's sort of continuing on his regular old day, looking around, seeing what's happening, and then all of a sudden a treat dispenser displays. So we do this a couple of times, and within a couple of sessions, this will start to look like dog is kind of hanging out, tone turns on, bit of a recognition response towards that, and you can see they go straight towards where the food is anticipated to come out of. So a very simple type of condition response that occurs. So responding increases until it reaches this kind of asymptotic level, and then it stays at that particular type of level. If you want to increase that asymptotic level or increase the magnitude of your conditioned response, the way to do this is going to be through increases of your unconditioned stimulus. So here we have a dog that is salivating, and we can present or pair or associate a bell with some type of unconditioned stimulus of, say, one steak, and we get a certain level of responding to the bell there. Or we could increase to 2 really large steaks, and we get subsequent increases in that asymptotic level that the bell can produce. So the asymptotic or the maximum level of conditioned responding that can occur is going to be related to the maximum level of conditioned responding that will occur to your unconditioned stimulus here, that reflexively associated stimulus. So here, a little bit of food would elicit this amount of salivation, where a lot of food will elicit more salivation. So the asymptotic level here is going to be sort of restricted to the magnitude that is elicited by the unconditioned stimulus itself. Increasing the unconditioned stimulus that is associated with a conditioned stimulus can subsequently then lead to a bigger conditioned response. What are some of these laws of respondence or laws of conditioned responses? Generally is that once conditioned, the CS must remain the same to elicit the conditioned response. So what I mean by that is, say, for example, you train your dog such that a yes is associated with the presentation of food, right? So you say, yes, here's some food. Yes, here's some food. And now your dog does something amazing or absolutely fantastic. So you're like, I need to give them something even better. So you're like, yes, and scream or shout at the dog. That's not going to actually change the type of or amount of conditioned responding that's going to come from that, because you functionally change what that CS is. So the CS needs to be consistent and similar. Differences in that conditioned stimulus will lead to drop-offs in conditioned responding, even if you make your conditioned stimulus more exaggerated in that particular situation. So a greater CS does not necessarily equal greater and faster conditioned responding. So also, I think it was Jurassic Park, famous example of taking the click and then clicking like several times towards dinosaurs. Not only there are several reasons why you probably don't want to be training dinosaurs, but particularly if you're going to be clicking 10,000 times, training a click with the association of food, you can't just click 10 times to then make it better. That's going to be changing what that CS is, so that it's not going to be the same as just a singular click. If you condition clicking 10 times before you deliver food, then that in of itself would be a fine CS. But if you typically train one click leads to food, then that it becomes your CS, and just changing that CS by clicking successively back to back several times, that's not going to actually produce greater condition responding or greater condition reinforcing properties. Next, extinction. So all good things can come to an end. So presenting the CS alone several times, so simply saying good boy, good dog, or delivering a click, and that never is followed up by the unconditioned stimulus, it will extinguish. It will no longer come to produce or elicit that conditioned response. So if you break that association between CS and US, you will also reduce that conditioned responding to the CS alone. So once you condition that a click is associated with food and you stop providing the food, you can get far enough along with the click alone, but it will eventually extinguish. And it will extinguish until it reaches its original sort of respondent or baseline levels of how often a click elicits salivation or whatever parameters or conditioned response you're talking about. So an example of this is going back to our initial acquisition. We have this increase, then we reach these asymptotic levels. Then if you present this conditioned stimulus alone, we'll get this decline of conditioning such that it will then reach baseline levels. If there's a 24-hour gap of time or just gaps of time in general, conditioned responding can spontaneously recover. It's called spontaneous recovery because it spontaneously recovers. You can also have situations where presentation of the US alone, like food itself, will actually re-increase responding again. But generally, repeated situations where 24 hours of just gaps of time or repeated situations of just presenting food alone, your CS presentation will completely extinguish such that there's essentially no responding to that conditioned stimulus at all. So conditioning once doesn't lead to forever responding. It has to be maintained to some degree, or else repeated presentation of that CS alone will lead to decreases. It's important to note that this is a separate process than forgetting. What I mean by that is there's a difference between, say, training your dog that, yes, every time you say yes, I give you a treat or I give you a toy, and then saying yes several times and not giving the treat or toy for over a certain period of time will lead to a decline. That is different than just simply training yes leads to treat or toy, and then going off to Europe for 6 months, coming back to that dog, and then saying yes, you're still going to get a response. You didn't extinguish that. And that's separate than the dog sort of forgetting that the CS or that yes means food is coming. That's a separate type of process. So forgetting can occur, but generally is not going to be that dramatic with our dogs. And it's a completely separate process than extinction alone. So next is going to be generalization. So I talked about if you change that conditioned stimulus to some degree, it's going to lead to decreases of conditioned responding. So if you train initially a yes and then go with yes or yeah, or whatever variation of that is, you'll get some conditioned responding, but it's going to be in decline or less than what that initial trained CS is. But the variations of responding that you get is what we would call generalization. So say, for example, you train a 1200 hertz tone as your conditioned stimulus. So I'll just use my own generation of tones, which is going to be wildly inaccurate, but we can just say, boo, because it's our CS here of 1200 tones. If I present variations of that tone to say, boo, and beep, and boo, oh, that was bad. The variations of those tones, you will still get some conditioned kinds of responding, but it will be subsequently less, or it will be, depending on how different it is, can be substantially lower than if you presented the originally trained conditioned stimulus. So this is what we would call some type of generalization curve, because it's kind of this curve related to generalization, or how variation of the presented stimulus leads to the amount or frequency of conditioned responses. And this is going to be different for how much you vary your particular stimulus. So greater variation of the stimulus will lead to less responding, and typically whatever direction, both either increasing or decreasing that particular type of stimulus. How generalization occurs from one stimulus to another, a lot of times can be difficult to predict, can be somewhat individualistic, can also depend on motivation levels. And when it comes to odors itself, can be wildly unpredictable, largely because odor stimuli don't really have a great sort of stimulus level here to be able to easily manipulate by increases or decreases. We have actually done some work with concentration of odor, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, now we will move on to a demonstration of conditioned responding with our friendly rat Sniffy.